The morning I signed the papers on the lake house in Muskoka, I poured myself a coffee, stood on the back deck, and listened to nothing. Just the water. Just the wind coming off the lake. Just the kind of quiet I hadn't had in 30 years of running a flooring business out of a warehouse in Barrie. I was 63 years old. My knees ached in the cold. My hair had gone fully silver somewhere around the time I turned 55 and stopped caring about it. I had a 12-year-old retriever named Biscuit who slept 14 hours a day and asked nothing of me except that I fill his bowl on time. That was my life. That was the life I had built after everything fell apart. After my daughter and her husband decided I wasn't worth keeping. I should back up. Her name is Claire. She's my only child. Her mother, my ex-wife Sandra, passed from a stroke when Claire was 19. And after that, it was just the two of us. I thought that meant something. I thought grief shared between two people created a bond that couldn't be broken. I was wrong about that. The same way I was wrong about a lot of things. Claire met her husband Liam at a sales conference in Calgary. He was 34, wore expensive watches, talked about disrupting markets the way other people talk about the weather, constantly and without saying anything. I didn't trust him the first time I shook his hand, but I told myself that wasn't my call to make. She was happy. He made her laugh. I kept my mouth shut. The trouble started small, the way trouble usually does. It was a comment at Christmas dinner. Liam said something about how I still had the Barrie mentality because I'd suggested driving instead of flying to visit family in London, Ontario. Just a practical observation, I thought. It's a 2-hour drive, but the way he said it, with that half smile that never quite reached his eyes, I knew it wasn't really about the drive. After that, Claire started missing calls. Sundays would pass without a word. When I did get through to her, she sounded distracted, like she was half listening to something else in the room. Her answers got shorter. Then the visits stopped. 3 years after the wedding, she sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with homework, where we'd eaten 100 quiet dinners after Sandra died, and she told me that Liam felt I was a negative presence in their lives, that I didn't respect his opinions, that my relationship with her was holding her back. I asked her what that meant. She couldn't really explain it. Or she wouldn't. She just kept using phrases that didn't sound like her, phrases that sounded borrowed from someone else's vocabulary. At the end of it, she asked me not to reach out for a while, that she needed space to figure out what she wanted. That while turned into 13 years. I know exactly how long it was because I marked it. Not on a calendar. I'm not that man. But I have a memory of every Christmas I spent without her. Every Father's Day I drove to the cemetery to talk to Sandra's headstone instead of sitting at a table with my own family. I remember the year the floors business hit its first million in revenue, and I had no one to call. I remember the year I got a clean bill of health after a scare with my prostate and sat in the parking lot of the Barrie Clinic for 20 minutes because there was nobody waiting for me inside. I worked, I built, I got very quiet and very good at being alone. The business grew more than I expected. I'd started it in my 40s with a lease on a warehouse and 2 employees. By the time I was 60, we were supplying hardwood and tile to commercial contractors across central Ontario. I sold the company to a regional chain in the spring of my 62nd year for a number I still don't say out loud without feeling slightly dizzy. After fees and taxes, I walked away with more money than I'd ever imagined having, and I felt absolutely nothing about it except tired. The Muskoka property came 6 months later. It wasn't the biggest place on the lake. It had 3 bedrooms, a proper dock, a wood stove that I'd already used more than I should have in September, and a view of the water that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like I might be okay. My neighbor Frank knew I was coming before I moved in. That's how it is in those communities. People notice a sold sign, and word travels. He brought over a bottle of rye the day I arrived and helped me carry boxes for 3 hours without asking a single personal question. I liked him immediately. His granddaughter Ellie was 14 that summer, a serious kid with dark braids and her grandfather's knack for silence. She'd come over sometimes when Frank was out, sit at my dock with a book, and occasionally say something so sharp and funny that I'd laugh out loud. I hadn't laughed that freely in years. I started to think of her like something adjacent to family, the way a man will when his own family has gone quiet. I was 2 years into my Muskoka life when Claire called. I almost didn't pick up. It had been so long that her name in my phone felt almost fictional, like seeing a name in a book you'd read once and mostly forgotten. I picked up on the fourth ring. Dad. One word. My name for me in her mouth. I sat down on the deck stairs. Claire. The conversation was short and strange. She said she and Liam had been going through some things, that things had been hard, that she'd been thinking about family a lot lately. She asked if she could come see me. I said yes before I thought about it, the way you reach for something before your brain has time to warn your hand. She came alone that first visit, without Liam. We walked along the water. She cried a little. I didn't push her to explain anything. I was so relieved to see her face, to see her older but still recognizably herself, that I made the mistake of just being grateful. We talked on the phone a few times after that. She asked questions about the property, how much I paid, what the insurance ran, whether the dock needed permits for expansion. I answered them. I was lonely, and she was my daughter, and the questions felt like interest. I understand now that interest and interest are different things. The call I remember most clearly came on a Tuesday in October, about 6 weeks after our reunion walk. She told me Liam had lost his position at the company he'd been with for 4 years. Something about a restructuring, though she was vague in a way that suggested there was more to the story. She said they'd had to let their house in Oakville go. They'd been renting, not owning, which surprised me. She said they needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet. Just temporarily, she said. Then she said Liam thought they could probably fit in the 2 larger guest rooms, that they'd want to give Liam's mother a room too, since she'd been staying with them and they couldn't leave her with nowhere to go. I set down my coffee mug very carefully on the kitchen counter. 3 rooms, for a temporary stay, for a woman I'd never met and a man who had cost me 13 years of my daughter's life. I said I'd need to think about it. When I told Frank about the call, he was quiet for a long time. We were in his garage, which is where he does his best thinking, surrounded by half-finished projects and old tools that smell like oil and his father. Finally, he said, "What does your gut say?" I knew what it said, but she was my daughter. I called her back 2 days later and said they could come for a visit. Just a visit, I was clear about that. And we'd talk in person. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent those 2 days making some phone calls of my own. I have a financial advisor named Ted, who I've worked with since the business started turning real money. I called Ted. I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman in Barrie named Patricia, who has handled my affairs for 15 years and has never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. I also called my old office manager, Gary, who has a brother-in-law who does private investigations and who owed me a favor from a business dispute 3 years back. What Gary's brother-in-law found in 2 weeks was more than I wanted to know and less than I was surprised by. Liam hadn't lost his position due to restructuring. He'd been let go for cause, something involving expense accounts and numbers that didn't add up. There were also 2 civil actions pending against him in Ontario court, both involving unpaid debts to former business partners. One of those creditors had been very persistent enough that there was documentation suggesting Liam had discussed using an asset not in his name as leverage to secure a short-term private loan. The asset referenced in those documents was a lakefront property in Muskoka. I read that twice. Then I poured myself something stronger than coffee and sat with it. My property, my retirement, my quiet mornings and my dog and my dock. He'd been using the idea of my home as collateral before he'd ever set foot in it, before I'd even agreed to let him come. I thought about what that meant for Claire, whether she knew, whether she was part of it or just caught up in it. I went back and forth on that for a long time. Then Frank told me about Ellie. He told me quietly, the way men tell each other difficult things, with his eyes on the middle distance and his hands around a mug of tea. Ellie had overheard something. She'd been on the dock one evening when Claire called Frank's number by mistake, got him instead of me, and stayed on the line a moment too long. What she'd heard was Claire talking to Liam, telling him that her father seemed more fragile than expected, that he was lonely enough to work with. Lonely enough to work with. I didn't sleep well the night Frank told me that. In the morning, I called Patricia. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I pay her for. When I was done, she said, "You understand what you need to do." I said I did. "And you can do it?" she asked. I looked out at the lake. It was November by then, the water steel gray, the birches stripped bare, the dock empty except for Biscuit sitting at the far end, watching something beneath the surface. "I'm 63, I said, "not fragile." She laughed, and it was the right kind of laugh. Claire, Liam, and his mother arrived on a Saturday in late November. I had a fire going. There was food. I had made the place look warm and welcoming and slightly more cluttered than it actually was because I wanted them to feel comfortable enough to stop performing. Liam shook my hand and held it a beat too long, the way men do when they're trying to establish something. He looked around the main room with the specific expression of a person doing math. His mother, a small, quiet woman named Roberta who seemed mortified to be there, apologized twice in the first 10 minutes for no reason I could identify. We had dinner. We talked. I let Liam lead most of the conversation because he needed to, and I find that you learn more about people when you let them talk. He brought it up himself over dessert, which was sooner than I expected. "The economy," he said. "The difficulty of finding the right opportunity in the current market. The importance of family supporting family." He used the word temporary 4 times. I nodded. I asked him, very calmly, whether he'd had a chance to look into refinancing options given the current rates. He said the situation was more complicated than that. I asked, still calmly, whether the complications had anything to do with the civil actions filed against him in Ontario Superior Court. The room went very quiet. Liam's face did something complicated. Claire's went still in a different way, the way a face goes still when something confirms what part of you already knew. I told them I wasn't angry. I said it, and I meant it mostly. I told them I understood that people make poor decisions under financial pressure, that I hadn't lived 63 years without making some of my own. But I told them that I had spoken with my lawyer, that my property was protected under a legal structure that made it unusable as collateral by any party, and that any arrangement we discussed about them staying here would be documented, time-limited, and conditional. I also told Liam very quietly, so his mother wouldn't have to hear it plainly, that I knew what he had said about my home before he arrived, that I knew the word he'd used, that if he wanted to rebuild any kind of relationship with me, that conversation would have to happen first honestly, without the performance. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. I don't know yet whether he meant it. That's the honest answer. Some things take time to reveal themselves, and I've learned to be patient. What I do know is what happened with Claire after he went to bed that night. She sat with me by the wood stove for 2 hours. She told me things I won't repeat here because they belong to her, not to the story. She cried in the way that people cry when they've been holding something for a very long time and the container finally gives. I didn't say much. I just kept the fire going. At the end of it, she said, "I don't know how you're not furious with me." I told her I had been. For years. That I'd worked through most of it alone because that was the only option I'd had. That I wasn't done with the anger entirely and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Because lying to her now after 13 years of silence seemed like a waste of both our time. She laughed a little at that, through the crying. She sounded, for a moment, exactly like herself at 19, sitting at my kitchen table the week after her mother's funeral, laughing at something sad because laughter was all that was left. I'm writing this from the deck. It's February. The lake is frozen solid, the way it gets out here, and Biscuit is asleep on my feet, keeping them warm. Claire is inside making breakfast. Liam is in Barrie this week. Meeting with a credit counselor. My condition, not a suggestion. His mother went back to her own place in Hamilton, where she apparently prefers to be, and I don't blame her. There's no dramatic final resolution to give you. Life doesn't tend to run that way, in my experience. What I have is a daughter who is sitting in my kitchen again. What I have is a document signed by my lawyer that protects everything I built. What I have is Frank and Ellie down the road, and the water, and the quiet. I know what some people will say, that I was too soft, that I should have turned them away at the door. Maybe. I've thought about it. But I'm 63 years old, and I know something now that I didn't know at 50, or 40, or 30. The point was never to win. The point was to stop losing pieces of myself without knowing it was happening. I lost 13 years to a man's ego and my own refusal to push harder. I won't lose another 13 years to the anger about it. What I sold was the business, the name on the warehouse, the client list, the equipment, the brand. What I kept, what nobody can use as collateral or leverage or currency, is the knowledge of who I am and what I'm worth. I know that now, standing on my own dock, in the cold, in the place I chose for myself. That's not nothing. After everything, that's not nothing at all. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It's not the dinner table confrontation or the phone call where I finally said what I knew. It's earlier than that. It's me sitting in a hospital parking lot in Barrie with a clean bill of health and nobody to call. That moment, more than any other, is where I understood what had quietly been taken from me. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. The way a tide goes out and you don't notice, until your feet are dry and the water is somewhere far away. I don't think Liam was born calculating. I think he was just a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that people could be managed. That loneliness in particular was something you could work with. And I think my daughter, who had lost her mother young and loved me imperfectly, and was trying to hold her marriage together, let herself believe what was easier to believe. That's not a defense of what happened. It's just the truth of how these things go. What I know now is that the life Liam tried to use against me, my retirement, my property, my quiet, was only possible because of years of choices I made when nobody was watching, getting up early, keeping my word with suppliers even when it cost me, staying honest with Gary and Patricia and the people who worked alongside me, not because I expected to be rewarded for it, but because I couldn't look at myself otherwise. That's the only thing I can point to when I try to explain why I still had something worth protecting when they arrived. It matters how you build things when the outcome isn't guaranteed. It matters enormously. And when Claire sat by that wood stove and cried, I didn't comfort her with easy words because I didn't have any. What I had was 13 years of thinking clearly about what I'd lost and what I still was, and that turned out to be more useful than any speech. I wasn't soft and I wasn't cruel. I just told her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. That took more out of me than the confrontation with Liam did, honestly. It's harder to stay honest with someone you love than with someone you're angry at. Frank said something to me around that time that I've thought about since. He said the only people who get genuinely surprised by consequences are the ones who stopped paying attention to causes a long time ago. Liam was surprised. Claire, I think, was not entirely. I'm not sure what the next year looks like. I don't know if Liam will do the work required, or whether Claire will have to make a harder choice down the road. What I know is that Ellie is going to be fine. She's sharp, and she's honest, and she's been raised by a man who shows up, and those things tend to hold. What I know is that I'm still standing on my own dock, and I'm still not fragile.